On the outskirts of a small town, there was an old house surrounded by a dense forest. The Smith family lived in this house. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were busy people and often went to work late. That's why their 16-year-old son, Jake, was often left home alone. But what started like an ordinary evening soon turned into a nightmare. One evening, when Jake's parents left for their business, he felt a strange feeling of anxiety. The air seemed filled with unusual tension, and the forest outside the window looked gloomy and threatening. Jake decided to ignore his restless feelings and went to bed. At night, when everyone in the house fell asleep, Jake suddenly woke up from strange sounds coming from the forest. These were steps, but unusually heavy and unnatural. Jake tried to take it for his imagination and fall asleep again, but the anxiety did not leave him. The next morning, Jake found strange traces around the house, dirty palm prints on the windows and doors. He tried to consider them, but could not determine who or what left these marks. This only increased his sense of anxiety. Every day, Jake felt that the invisible threat was getting closer and closer. He began to close and lock every door and window in the house, hoping that it would help him feel safer. One day, on his way home from school, Jake heard footsteps following him from the forest. He stopped and looked around, but didn't see anyone. Fear made him speed up, but the sounds continued to haunt him like ghosts from the past. On his birthday, Jake received strange anonymous messages on his phone. They said that someone was watching him and knew all his secrets. Jake began to feel that his life was turning into a nightmare. One evening, when Jake's parents were at work, he heard the sound of broken glass. He realized that someone had invaded their house. His heart beat harder when he realized that his fears had become a reality. Jake resolutely climbed the stairs to check the source of the noise. In deep darkness, he met the gaze of his pursuer. It was a man with crazy eyes and a knife in his hand. Jake had to fight for his life in a fight in the dark. When the parents returned home, they found Jake sitting in the corner of the room, exhausted and scared. He told them about the uninvited guest and how he had to fight for his life. But none of them believed his story. After that incident, nothing was found, neither the trace of the attacker nor the evidence of his penetration. Jake began to doubt whether it really happened or whether it was just a product of his imagination. But his fears did not subside. Since then, Jake has begun to receive anonymous threatening letters. They said that the one who broke into their house would come back to finish what they started. Jake felt that his life was in danger. Jake started looking for answers to his questions. He studied the history of his house, questioned his neighbors, and even asked the local police for help. But all his efforts did not lead to anything. Soon, Jake began to suspect everyone around him. He began to think that his friends or even his own parents might have been involved in this mysterious incident. He felt lonely and intimidated. Fear and anxiety began to take over Jake more and more. He began to see and hear strange things, doubt his common sense, and often wake up at night in a cold sweat. His reality began to collapse. Jake understood that he was left alone against an invisible enemy who could also be anywhere and any time. He felt defenseless and hopeless. It seemed to him that there was no way out of this nightmarish situation. But Jake decided that he wouldn't give up without a fight. He decided to use all his strength and resources to find the villain and protect his home and his family. After all, he was the only one who could and should stop this madman. Jake started his own investigation. He monitored every suspicious sign, collected evidence, and analyzed the data. He was preparing for a fight, which, according to his premonitions, would inevitably come. Jake continued to immerse himself in his world of illusions and fears. He was more and more convinced himself that he was being haunted by some invisible threat. The whispers in his head were getting louder, and the ghosts he saw seemed more and more real to him. But when he turned to a psychiatrist for help, he diagnosed schizophrenia. With a diagnosis of schizophrenia, Jake realized that his enemy was not a real threat, but his own mind. He started treatment, hoping for recovery. Although the path to recovery was difficult and long, Jake hoped that one day he would be able to overcome his fears and illusions and return to normal life. My husband disappeared 6 months ago. He just went to work one day and never came back home. The event shocked all our neighbors, as such a thing had never happened in our quiet suburb, surrounded by white lace fences. The police started an investigation. The neighborhood watch patrolled the area, but no one found any clues to explain what happened to him. Our family struggled with grief in vain. Not long ago, the last missing posters with my husband's face disappeared, torn or buried under new announcements. The police contacted me less and less, and gradually the calls ceased altogether. I accepted the new reality. As difficult as it was, I admitted that my Rick would never return. And then he came back. Last week, I was watering petunias behind the house when I heard the garden gate creak open. Instinctively, I turned my head. It was him, exactly the same as on the day he disappeared. The wind tousled the same light hair, the same bright blue eyes sparkled, the same lips curved in a smile. In shock, I stood frozen. We mourned him for so long, yet here he was, standing in the garden, as if he had just stepped out for a moment to get some milk. I asked him where he had been. He didn't know. He couldn't remember anything about the last 6 months. Everyone was overjoyed, friends, our families. They could hardly believe their eyes. But not me. Listen, I understand this sounds insane. Our families will never believe me, and I would never go to the police unless I wanted to spend the rest of my days in a straitjacket. But I just know that the man sleeping in my bed is not my husband. I don't know what to do. Intellectually, I know I should be happy, but I'm not. I'm terrified. I don't know much about the supernatural, paranormal stuff. I don't even watch horror movies, but this situation sends shivers down my spine. Just listen, I'll explain why I'm so sure. And maybe someone out there will believe me and tell me what to do now. The morning after Rick returned, I made him a cup of tea. He took it, giving me the most radiant smile. Then he took a sugar cube from the sugar bowl and dropped it into the cup. Since his return, our home has been plunged into a whirlwind of feverish chaos, and I was still in shock and didn't attach any importance to it at the time. But that episode stuck in my mind. Call it trivial, but my husband never drank tea with sugar. He believed it ruined the taste of the drink and always got upset if I accidentally added sugar to his cup. Yet that person drank tea with sugar. The next clue was golf. A few days ago, there was a golf tournament, and Rick was visiting his mother at the time. His favorite player was playing, so I recorded the tournament to make sure he wouldn't miss anything. He was a huge golf fan. He once even canceled our anniversary to watch the championship. But when he came home and I showed him the recording, he didn't react. No, of course, he said thank you and all that, then just asked if I wanted dinner, and didn't even touch the TV. Then one night I woke up around 2 and saw Rick's face just a couple of inches above mine. He was staring at me with empty eyes. "Darling, what's wrong?" I asked nervously. He didn't answer. For another 30 seconds he just stared through me, and then suddenly smiled and said, "Sorry, honey. I still sometimes can't believe this is all real." And then he turned onto his other side and fell asleep. But not me. Yesterday marked about a week since his return. The neighbors gathered for a party to celebrate the event. People from our street and neighboring streets came to assure Rick how happy they were that he was okay. He was constantly in the midst of the crowd, sometimes standing beside me, hugging me, sometimes mingling around, chatting amiably with everyone, even with the kids. Jackson Sally's little son, our neighbor, wanted to play hide and seek, and Rick happily went with him. And let me tell you, he would never do something like that. My husband claimed he didn't like kids. That's why we didn't and couldn't have kids. That's why he never played with the neighborhood kids. Especially with Jackson, Rick literally avoided him. Shortly before his disappearance, I began to suspect that my husband was simply trying not to be around the boy so that no one would notice their subtle but obvious resemblance. The final nail in the coffin was Sally herself. This morning she knocked on our door. She stood on the threshold with a large tray of pastries as an excuse to come in, but I understood that she just wanted to assess the situation with her own eyes. I escorted her out and called her an annoying busybody. And Rick just laughed, kissed me on the forehead, and agreed. Can you imagine? That's when I was finally convinced that this person cannot be my husband. Rick would fly into a rage if I insulted Sally, as if I had no reason to hate her, as if she hadn't been sleeping with my husband behind my back for years. But today everything was quiet. He no longer tried to defend her. I know what you're thinking. It's entirely possible that he had an accident, hit his head, and the memories simply got erased, maybe even altering his personality. And that's a perfectly good, logical explanation. I won't argue. That's exactly what the police would tell me if I decided to tell them my story. But you know why I'm absolutely certain that this person is not my husband? He doesn't have the scar. Just like that. If it really was Rick, he would have a scar on his forehead from the golf club I hit him with. But it's not there. Not a trace. Honestly, I'm ready to dig up my petunias tonight just to make sure his body is still there. I have no idea who I'm sharing a bed with, but it's definitely not my husband.